Hello and welcome to the LMI podcast. This is the fourth and penultimate episode in a 5-part series looking at the Great Commission texts of the New Testament. In our series so far, we've looked at Luke 24, Acts 1 and John 20. And if you'd like to listen to those earlier episodes, you can find them in our podcast library. In today's episode, we're focusing on Mark 16, verse 15. So grab a Bible, pause the podcast while you find the passage, and then we'll take a look together. This particular commission statement appears in what is known as the longer ending of Mark. It's referred to in this way because in many of the early manuscripts, Mark's Gospel ends at verse 8. As such, what we find in the majority of English text Bibles is a note regarding verses 9 to 20. The material in this longer ending has been considered by many to be a later addition, to bring some level of closure to Mark's sharp ending in verse 8. Now, since the overall message of this longer ending is in agreement with the wider biblical witness, we still want to consider verse 15 in our podcast series. It is a well-known mission-themed text that has inspired many into Great Commission obedience, including Adoniram Judson, America's first officially commissioned foreign-bound missionary. So, let's take a look at Mark chapter 16, verse 15 together and see what we find in this text. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation." Now, in the flow of this longer ending to Mark, this verse records some of what the resurrected Jesus said to his disciples before his ascension to heaven. He rebuked them for their unbelief in verse 14 before commissioning them with the words of verse 15. So what we see straight away is that this is another direct commission from Christ to his followers. He is the source of this commission, and as such, his followers are accountable to him. These words essentially form a command which demands a response, just as we have seen in the other New Testament commission texts. Here Jesus says, "Go." An active response is required if his followers are to obey. It's not simply a general command to go somewhere either. Jesus is specific with his instruction, indicating what they are to do and where. His followers are left in no doubt as to the nature and scope of the commission. It's a response that Jesus himself enables. Jesus directs, and so his followers can respond. They are enabled by his commission. So, where are they to go? Well, they are to go into all the world. Note the sphere of their service. There are no limits. And what are they to do? Jesus says they are to proclaim the gospel. So what we see here is that they are commissioned to proclaim. They have a message to announce, something to share, an announcement to make. And that is, of course, the announcement of the good news of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, and God's purpose in these events. That is to be the content of their proclaiming mission. As we consider this Great Commission text from Mark, what are we, as followers of Jesus today, to take from it? Well, we're going to highlight 4 things. Yet again, we must come face to face with that which is a direct command of Jesus, requiring our obedient response. He says, "Go." Once more, we recognize that the Great Commission of Christ is not some optional extra for some of his people. As Hudson Taylor reportedly said, the Great Commission is not an option to be considered, it is a command to be obeyed. Or more recently, as John Piper has said, go, send, or disobey. Secondly, we must recognize the global scope of Christ's mission for his followers. There are to be no limits. We are sent into all the world. That means across the street and over the oceans. It means near and far. There can be no place that is to be considered off limits in Christ's gospel mission. Any limits to this activity stem from us and not from him. Thirdly, we're reminded once again, as in the other texts that we've considered in this series, that the central figure in this mission is to be Jesus. The core message that his people are to announce is centered upon him, who he is, what he's done, and why that matters. We're not to get knocked off course by focusing our proclamation on any other message. We must proclaim Jesus. That continues to be a real challenge to us today when there are so many other truth claims across the nations, so many other claims for importance and demands for attention. But we must proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. And finally, we must notice the comprehensive scope for this proclaiming task, displayed in the words, "to the whole creation." Now, what does this mean? Well, just as there are to be no places considered off limits, there are to be no people considered off limits either. We must not only reach nations, but neighborhoods too. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we must recognize that nations are home to all sorts of different ethnic groups, subcultures, and social groupings who form communities and affinity blocks. All of them are to receive the message of good news that we must bring. Now, this important distinction between nations and peoples is something we'll think about in a little more detail in our final episode in this series, when we'll be looking at Matthew's famous Great Commission statement. But until then, for further information about how we at Logos Ministries International are responding to the commission of Christ, and for information about how you might join with us in this task, please visit us online at www.lmi-org.net. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle LMI_connect, or find us on Facebook by searching for Logos Min International. Thank you for listening, and do join us next time on the LMI podcast.